Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, striking up the live stream, 8 o'clock Eastern time, 5 o'clock on the West Coast. We got Chris Fetters on the line from dogman.com. It's the 247 sports platform for Washington Athletics. Chris, how you doing tonight?
Good, Mark. I would normally with the stream like this, I would maybe put something up in the background, but you get my dazed and confused poster instead, I guess. So it's all good.
We will take it as long as what is coming out of your mouth makes sense. That's all we care about, and I'm guessing that's going to be the case. I've got full confidence coming from the fine outfit there at 247 Sports. For years, Chris, I had nothing but a blank wall behind me.
There you go.
And, some people would comment, you need to do something with that, and I finally did. So there you go. Chris joins us again from dogman.com, talking Washington football with the Huskies. One big game under its belt with a trip to Atlanta to take on the Auburn Tigers. And, of course, this is the first dive into the Pac-12 play, going to Utah to take on the Utes. Of course, we're the voice of college football, so please like, comment, and subscribe. All right, Chris. So the injury report hurts mostly along the offensive line. Trey Adams, one of the best in the business, all Pac-12 performer, missing the first two games of the season. Also some other issues along the offensive front and otherwise.
Yeah. Trey is one of those guys. Typically, the way Chris Peterson does his injury stuff is that everyone's week to week unless, someone is out a significant period of time. I mean, 6 to 8 weeks plus, or is out for the season. And with Trey, he announced on his Instagram last week he was going in surgery. It looked like maybe back surgery. We couldn't tell. His knee was the one that actually caused him to lose a lot of his season last year. He tore up his knee at the loss at Arizona State. And so, we thought that was going to be an issue. And then all of a sudden it came up that his back was affecting him. So we don't know if that was part of trying to get back as soon as possible, those types of things, whether or not there was an issue that was caused there. But, Peterson he's been a little salty with the press in the last week or so because of the reporting of it. Didn't like the fact that it had kind of gotten out there and people in the Times and Seattle Times and other people had been reporting on it. So hasn't really let us know what Trey Adams' long-term prognosis is, but he just says he's going to address it. He said that on Monday. So maybe this time next week we'll know a lot more. But as of now, we don't expect him back anytime soon. It might even be a stretch to say if he gets back by the end of the season. We don't know. We literally don't know what the status is. We assume this surgery was a success, whichever surgery it was. And so right now that's a huge blow for them. But in his stead, Jared Hilbers, the left tackle who started the last couple of games, has actually done a very nice job.
Okay, so that was the next question, because certainly there's a reason guys are listed number one on the depth chart, and people that follow college football in particular know about Trey Adams and maybe to a little lesser degree Nick Harris. But when a program's been built up to the extent of a Chris Peterson program there at Washington, where the recruiting classes the last couple have been extremely good, there's less of a drop off from the first to second team because the depth is so good. Any speculation on how much you mentioned that, but how much this hurts? Do we expect significant drop off there?
Well, I think on paper, sure there was. I mean, now Jared Hilbers is a kid who's, he's a guy that's been in the program a few years. He's played in a number of games, but has never started until the Auburn game. So that was obviously a significant thing, at least on paper. People were very aware that there's going to be a big drop off. I mean, there just is. You can't replace a preseason All-American with a guy who has some experience but has never had any start, and especially a start on that big a stage. So, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that was going to be a big part. And then also they were, replacing a guy in Coleman Shelton who had played center all of last year, but he was a guy that's gotten starts at every single position along the offensive line. You just don't see that anymore. And with that kind of experience. And so Nick Harris, even though he was the starter last year at right guard, he was moving over to center, and he had never played center before. So that was a thing that the people were going to have to look at on the offensive line as well. And then after week one, he is apparently banged up to the point where he can't even play against North Dakota. So we know, not to jump too far afield, but we know, like, for instance, Bryce Love isn't going to play this weekend for Stanford against UC Davis. Well, could it be that Nick Harris was kind of banged up to the point where he won't play against a team like North Dakota because they want to make sure that he's 100% for a big road trip to Utah, for instance? So we don't know if that's in play or not, but that's something else that people are having to deal with in terms of trying to figure out how this offensive line is going to come together. And then, the other thing that was kind of interesting too is that they had a potential senior replace Nick Harris at right guard in a guy named Matt James. And now all of a sudden it comes out for the Auburn game that a redshirt freshman, Jackson Kirkland, who's a UW legacy, ends up playing in that position instead of the guy with a ton of starts. So you've got a ton of moving parts along this offensive line that goes from something that could have been really, really stable. When you talk about Trey Adams at left tackle and a guy like Caleb McGarry at right tackle, arguably the best tackle duo in the country, at least in the Pac-12, and now all of a sudden that's been broken up, and then you have some real turmoil in the interior three positions along the offensive line. This is where, obviously everything starts on offense, and for them to have so much turnover and so many kind of unknowns, even going into the third game of the year, it's certainly something that Washington fans have been rightly concerned about.
Got Chris Fetters on the line from 247 Sports. The platform is dogman.com, the Washington athletic site there on 247. Chris, I thought for week one, the two best football teams on one field that played the best game. Now, not necessarily the most exciting, especially for fans that want to see a ton of points and huge plays and offenses going back and forth. But in terms of complete games played by both sides of the ball, both teams hard hitting, fought tooth and nail, I should say. Auburn, Washington, excellent effort by the Huskies. It can be interpreted a couple different ways. A loss is a loss. You need to step up, especially if you're in the Pac-12, and show that you can play on the national stage and beat a top 10 to 15 team. On the other hand, to me, that shows that most likely if those two teams played 10 times, they'd split 5-5. That, of course, doesn't matter, that the result's the result. But I'm looking at quality play, and I thought Washington acquitted itself rather well. But of course, it puts itself in a position where they basically need to run the table unless all hell breaks loose elsewhere.
Right. No, I agree 100%. If the playoff is still within their sights and that's what their goal is, they're going to have to run the table, because we've seen that there's been no two-loss team to ever make the playoff. So I think it's that simple. If you're looking at, did Auburn and Washington acquit themselves as two top 10 worthy teams on that particular week? I think they did. And I think when you have two top 10 teams like that playing in a neutral environment, that essentially was an Auburn home game. I mean, if you look at the attendance split, it was probably about 90-10 in favor of Auburn. And, you look at all of those things and you put everything into the mix. I just think you're going to come up with a game, like you said, that may have been somewhat exciting for the neutral, even if there wasn't a ton of points. But at the same time, I think when you have two top 10 teams that are slugging each other out like these guys did, you're gonna have maybe some mistakes, you're gonna have some penalties, but you're also gonna have some really big plays, and you're gonna have some sudden change moments and all the things that come into the equation when two top 10 teams are playing. Turnovers were massive. The goal line by the fumble by Jake Browning near the goal line with Nick Coe was huge. I mean, they turned that into points, and all of a sudden, like you said, you can reverse the score. So yeah, I think ultimately, I think they came away from that nationally feeling not so much vindicated, because I think there was so much that the Pac-12, the conference itself, had kind of put on their shoulders, that you have to play, at least you have to play well in a loss, which they did. But at the same time, these guys, they go to win. I mean, they're not taking this. There's no moral victories, that's for sure. And we'll see how much they bounce back in terms of going back into another hostile environment, because Chris Peterson all week long, Mark, has talked about this being an even a crazier environment, because you're literally, on campus. I mean, Rice-Eccles Stadium at the University of Utah is right in the base of the Wasatches there, and it's as hostile as any place in the Pac-12. The student section there is absolutely, they're crazy. And then you add to it a blackout, you add to it the late night. thing, and those guys are going to have plenty of time to get revved up for that particular game, and so you have all the makings of another classic confrontation with two really really well coached teams.
My two takeaways from the Auburn game were, and I understand a lot of people took away the repeated bogging down in the red zone, but I speak and give that as much to the Auburn defense and defensive front as I do to the Washington offense. What my two takeaways are is that Washington's offensive line, minus Trey Adams, wasn't sturdy enough to put up with one of the top 5 defensive lines in the country in Auburn, number one. But number two, that there's a litany of Washington receivers that only caught 5 to 10 passes last year that were called into duty against one of the best teams in the country, and they were making crazy catches all over the field. So the Washington wide receivers, I thought, though not prolific in quantity, in terms of quality of receptions downfield against that Auburn secondary, I thought were really good.
Yeah, I think that's right, and there's no doubt. You look at guys like Quentin Pounds and Chico McClatcher, some of the Washington receivers. They were out for a big part of the year last year. I mean, Chico McClatcher got hurt in the 4th game against Colorado. You look at Quentin Pounds; he was kind of, even though he played a handful of games during the year, he was kind of banged up here and there. Really, never got a consistent run of games where he could show the kind of form that he's capable of having, like he has these last couple of games, where he has that circus, that highlight reel catch. In Atlanta against Auburn, that was a huge touchdown for Washington when they really, really needed it, down a couple scores early. So, yeah, there's no doubt. And I would also say with the offensive line too, you add to the lack of having your premier left tackle, also all the communication issues that come into that. And, when all it takes is one guy, Mark, against the offensive line. You have to have all 5 guys in sync. And if there's one guy that busts, assignment error, all that kind of stuff, it looks awful. I mean, Washington had a 4th and 1 quarterback sneak that got stuffed because of an assignment error against North Dakota, according to Chris Peterson. So that'll tell you a little bit about how bad it can be when you don't have the 5 guys that you thought you were going to go to war with, and now all of a sudden you've got to start mixing and matching a little bit. And that's not to say that Washington wasn't prepared for this. They knew that Trey Adams was going to be 50-50 at best to start the season out. So they played Jared Hilbers a lot there. They played also a guy, Henry Roberts, out there a lot. They played a redshirt freshman, Henry Bainavalu, out there a lot. So they rotated a bunch of guys to try to see who maybe the best fit was going to be in case they lost Trey Adams. And so they've been prepping for this. They've been trying to do this, but you just can't rep the live experience in practice. And once you get it in front of that crowd, it's amazing how human nature can change. And now all of a sudden everything, he called it the performance anxiety curve, Chris Peterson did. And I think that was definitely part of the thing that was on display against Auburn for sure.
I make the argument, Chris, that while the quarterback's the most important position and player on the field, that the unit of the offensive line is the most important unit. And to your point, it's not only the most important unit, arguably, but it's also in need of the most cohesion. The players have to work together, probably linebackers to a certain extent, the secondary, but nowhere close to the offensive line. That unit has to work together unlike any other unit. So if you have issues, if you have to shuffle guys, whatever it is, if you have versatile players, sure, you can absorb those kind of issues. But if you don't, then you're shuffling guys, or you're bringing in a guy from the bench who's not necessarily one of your top or 5 or 6 players, but he fits a spot and somebody else isn't versatile enough. And you got to kind of play that game as to, do we get our best 5 guys out there, or do we have certain guys that have to play certain positions? And that has caused offensive lines to be a little more versatile in recent years because of that turnover. Speaking of which, Chris, and we got Chris Fetters on the line from dogman.com, 247 Sports Washington platform right there, is so you've seen the Huskies play 2 games. We got such a turnover in college football talent because of only playing 3 or 4 years at most. Who have you seen in the 2 games that has stepped up or stood out in positive or negative fashion that maybe we didn't see a whole lot of last year, that wasn't counted on, but is going to have to make an impact this year?
Well, I'd say on offense for sure. I kind of mentioned guys like Chico McClatch or Quentin Pounds, and it wasn't that we didn't think they were going to be counted on or things like that. It's just that they weren't available last year. They just got banged up. So we assumed that they were going to be a much bigger part of the offense this year, simply because there weren't a lot of guys in place of them that had the kind of experience that those guys have had. So you add to those guys the one real stalwart coming back from last year, who was Aaron Fuller, and then you add to him the true sophomore Ty Jones, who's actually going back to Utah this weekend because he's originally from Provo. That's where he played his high school ball. So you add to those guys all of the different receivers into that mix. You've got a couple redshirt freshmen in Alex Cook and Terrell Bynum. So they have bodies. I mean, they haven't even had one of their true freshman stars that were maybe expected to come out. Guys like Marcus Spiker, Austin Osborne, Trey Lowe. All three of those guys, we thought maybe, at least on paper before fall camp, we thought maybe those guys would be contributors early, simply because no one really knew who was going to step up and be one of those main receiving contributors. But as it's turned out through the first two games, it's kind of the names that, on paper, we kind of would expected. The veterans have kind of stepped up and done what they're supposed to do. And ironically enough, the receivers have kind of ended up being the real strength early on of the offense, because the running game just hasn't gone. And you've got Myles Gaskin, who's Washington's now. He's all-time leading rusher. He just overtook Napoleon Kaufman during the Auburn game. He had the one kind of 25-yard run, and that put him over the top. He literally he has more yards than any other UW running back in history, and yet he only has a less than 130 yards through two games. We would have thought it was going to be closer to 175, 180, maybe even close to 200. And but he's had slow starts in his career. Like last year, it took 3 games. I remember the third game they won against Fresno State, and then the next week they had a big away game right off the bat at Colorado, just like they're doing this weekend. And Colorado had just come off playing Washington in the 2016 Pac-12 championship game. So we thought, wow, Colorado, this is going to be a huge test. This is going to be an early indicator. And Washington got off to a slow start again in the game, but eventually just kind of rolled over Colorado, and Gaskin had over 200 yards. So I don't know if that's going to happen this weekend, Mark. I mean, you just don't know. But historically, the run game has, as Chris Peterson would say, it's taken a minute to kind of get going, to kind of get into a rhythm. And they haven't necessarily had a lot of opportunities. Like at Auburn, for instance, they only, I think they had run less than 60 plays, or right around 60 plays. And so they just did not have a lot of opportunities to create continuity and create rhythm in that run game, to start maybe setting some other things up in as far as the pass. So, they've got to get those running guys going for sure, like Myles Gaskin, Savon Ahmed for sure. But adding those receivers we talked about was big. I think a guy like Cade Otton, the tight end, is a guy who's a pass receiving threat who can do some stuff. And then you talk about impact guys on defense. Ariel Nada is certainly a guy that we hadn't featured much going into the fall, because he was banged up his entire redshirt freshman year last year, and then was even kind of banged up a little bit this fall, but had a couple big plays at Auburn, and then had even a couple more big plays against North Dakota. So as an outside linebacker, he offers up a threat that's really, really different than almost anybody else that they have, because he's 30 to 40 pounds lighter than most of their outside linebackers. So he is certainly a change of pace guy. And, I think in the linebacker situation, they've got some fluidity there. They moved a senior, Tevis Bartlett, inside for fall camp, but then they put him back outside for Auburn. They put him back inside for North Dakota. So he's kind of a guy that, based on game plan, they're going to kind of put him wherever they think they need him the most. They need to have some of these other younger guys come into the fold. They do have a couple of freshmen in Jackson Sermon and MJ Tafisi that actually played a little bit, just a few snaps at during the North Dakota game, but I think could maybe even see some more time in the coming weeks. So those are some guys for sure. I mean, the secondary is so loaded. They've got legitimately 8-9 guys that can play along those 4 and 5 positions without even going into the freshman depth. So there's too much talent there to even talk about. We could take probably a whole segment and talk about those guys.
Enjoying the conversation on Washington football with Chris Fetters. We can catch him there at dogman.com. It's the 247 sports platform for Washington football. Chris Peterson, how good is he? Why is he so good? National championships to me are an overemphasis on a resume just because so much has to come together and you got to take into consideration facilities and name brand and all those other things that help a coach or hurt a coach, recruiting base, all those other things. So it goes, Nick Saban, Urban Meyer, and then Dabo Swinney suddenly is a great coach because he won a national title, whereas he was just okay, a few months earlier. But Chris Peterson's a guy that obviously did what he did at Boise State, and the building blocks were already there. They were already on the rise, but he really brought Boise State to the place where they were at the pinnacle of their existence. And then he comes to Washington and they were in the abyss at one point. They got to respectability, and then he takes them from 500 level football to on the cusp of national championships and owning the Pac-12. Why is he so good? What does he do? What does he bring to the table in your eyes?
Oh, I think it's a couple things. I think first it starts off with what he found at Washington when he got to UW. Steve Sarkisian, for all the 7-win seasons and all those things that you talked about, kind of taking them from maybe average football or slightly above average football to playoff potential and all that. I think one of the things is Steve Sarkisian really stacked the cupboard. There was a ton of talent coming back. If you think of guys like Budda Baker, John Ross, Kevin King, Sidney Jones, now Marcus Peters was there for a while. There's a ton. Vita Vea was a guy that they recruited, but he was a guy that was initially recruited by Sarkisian to Washington, and Tosh Lapoy when Tosh was at Washington. So there was so much talent here at Washington to begin with, because all those guys I listed are on NFL rosters now. They had the building blocks in place. It was simply a matter of Peterson taking the time that he needed to instill his culture, his value system, his beliefs, all of those things. And like he said, he talked about it. When you talk to the CEOs of really successful companies, he says it takes anywhere from 18 to 24 months to really establish the foundation of your culture and how you do your business. And so I think that's why they went 7 wins in the first year, 7, 8 wins. And then the second year they did a little bit better. But then by that third year, 2016, that's when they went all the way to the playoff. And I think it's because the culture had finally taken hold. They were able to recruit the other pieces that they needed, like a Jake Browning and some of Myles Gaskin, some of these other pieces to kind of put everything in place. And now it's just a matter that they're reloading. I mean, it's not a rebuild. They're constantly getting the talent now. They're really finding the niches in the recruiting places out west, and then supplementing that with an occasional guy from Texas or from different parts to really put together everything that they need. And they are really looking. Fit is like the operative word. They really are looking for the kind of kid that fits their program, a kid that's going to be as competitive off the field as on the field, does everything right, practices how they want to play. First guy out there, last guy, first guy to practice, last guy to leave type of guy. Just all of the things that they're looking for. It's kind of reminiscent a little bit of what I think Stanford looks for in their guys, but I don't think they're maybe directly competing with Stanford on a number of guys, but they're also looking at the same guys that go to USC and UCLA and what have you as well. But now with the SEC schools starting to come up to the Northwest and offering kids, they're obviously going up against those kind of guys as well. So I can tell you a number of kids that signed with Washington in the last year or two that Washington was directly competing with Notre Dame and Alabama and Florida State and some of these other programs that from other parts of the country that maybe in years past they hadn't really gone head to head with. So again, it starts with talent, starts with getting those guys in, because in my experience, I've always thought about what was told to me when I was kind of growing up through this business is that it's not about the X's and O's, It's about the Jimmies and the Joes, right? So first of all, they had to get the guys that were NFL capable, and clearly they have taken the talent that was NFL capable and put those guys in the NFL right now. And now, so they're in that cycle, but they're also trying to find the guys that really fit what they're looking for, guys that they don't necessarily have to ride. They don't have to motivate them. They're these are kids that the acronym that they use up here is OKG. They call them our kind of guys. They're always looking for the OKGs. And Chris Peterson talks about the program that he uses is called Built for Life. And so it's the classic thing. We're not recruiting you for the next 4 years. We're recruiting you for the next 40 years. So when you see a lot of these guys they're making it in the pros now, they're still talking about Washington. They're still like Kevin King, even though he's at Green Bay now and he's doing all those things. He was an honorary captain for the Auburn-Washington game, and he went down there and he was all like, "Where are my dog fans at? Where's this is a kid from Southern California or from Northern California." Until he went to Washington, he didn't have any connection really with UW, but he really bought into what Chris Peterson was all about, and Jimmy Lake was his position coach, and Jimmy just made him better and better and better and better by the time he got drafted. And so he'll always be a guy that considers Seattle his second home, and that's just going to continue to keep going and going, because they had 5-6 guys drafted last year. It could be 5-6 guys drafted at least for this coming season, and it's something that builds on itself, Mark. But it starts with them, and then it's all about them taking advantage of the opportunities that Washington gives them on and off the field, and like I said, they're looking for kids that want that whole experience. They don't want kids that major in football. And I know that's probably going to sound really, really weird for a lot of fans out there of college football that are used to the Alabamas and the Ohio States and whatever, that, yeah, they get their degree, but no one really ever talks about the educational side of it. Well, for Chris Peterson, those guys, it's a huge piece.
And that's the way it should be. We've come to the point of no return. I heard a conversation at a luncheon with Jim Delaney in which he was talking about as a North Carolina, and we're talking the North Carolina basketball player in 1968 that went to a Final Four, but just the chasm of requirements placed on him in the late 60s as, again, a player that went to a national championship game as a varsity basketball player, and then versus what he has to face and try to sanction and regulate as a conference commissioner in regards to the strains and the expectations and the requirements and the workload placed on these athletes, because the bar keeps, if some other conference, some other team squeezes out a little bit more playing time or practice time, and then you got to keep up, and it's just inched up over the years, and now it's become basically a profession at that level. So that's good to hear out of Chris Peterson there at Washington. We got Chris Fetters on the line from dogman.com. Join him right there at 247 Sports for Washington athletics coverage. Of course, football is king, especially this time of year. This is Mark Rogers TV, voice of college football. We bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the nation. Want to remind you about our newsletter. It's only 2 weeks old. We've got over 60 on the mailing list already, receiving positive feedback. So if you want to jump on the line for the Voice of College Football newsletter, which is released every Monday, just send your email address to mine, which is MarkRogersTV at Gmail. Send your email to mine, MarkRogersTV at Gmail. Like, comment, and subscribe. That helps build the platform here at Mark Rogers TV. So Washington's the class of the Pac-12 most likely. Can they make it to a college football playoff? Probably have to run the table. Utah, where do they stand in the Pac-12 South? Well, I picked them to win the division, even though they had the most narrow path in my estimation, because I don't think they've got the most talent, but I think they have the best team. And unfortunately for them, they've got to go through Stanford and Washington, while some of the direct competition they have in the South only has to play. For example, USC doesn't have to face Washington. So despite that narrow path and the odds against me, I picked Utah to face Washington in the Pac-12 title game. It's typically, Chris, a Utah team that, they've got a quarterback coming back for his second season in Tyler Huntley, a 1,000-yard running back in Zach Moss. Britain Covey missed 2 years due to an LDS, and he caught for over 100 yards at Northern Illinois. They bring a good defense, but they're typically limited in terms of dynamic players. Don't know if you've had a chance to break down a whole lot of Utah football, but your thoughts about the Utes coming into this one.
Well, sure. I mean, the last couple, years between Utah and Washington have been pretty amazing games. I don't know, again, for the people that only follow this kind of nationally, the 2 years ago in Washington's playoff run, Washington won at Utah 31-24, and they did it with a Dante Pettis punt return with about 4 minutes left in the game. So it was nip and tuck the entire way. And then this last season, Utah had to come to Seattle, and Washington was down. What were they down? 7 points with a minute left. And Myles Gaskin did a wildcat, ran it in. They tied the game with about 55 seconds left, I think, in the game. Were able to actually get the ball back with about 30 seconds left. And Jake Browning completed a big long pass to Andre Bocelli, got it down to probably 25-ish. And so I think they had about a 40-yard, right around a 40-yarder, so it was just inside the 25. And, their kicking had been super spotty all season long, but Tristan Vizcaino came in and buried it as time expired. So they won a game 33-30, and it ended up being Jake Browning's first come-from-behind victory as a starter, which is pretty crazy to think of, because if he's been a starter since his true freshman year. This is his 4th year as a starter. His first actually come from behind victory, like being behind in the 4th quarter, coming back. That's their first come from behind victory under Jake Browning in 4 years. So you can tell he's definitely more of a front running type of guy. He's very hard. They're very hard to catch up and beat, like Auburn did kind of in the 4th quarter, even though Washington, they did jump ahead like 16-15 in that 4th quarter early on, only to end up losing that game. But typically when a Jake Browning led Washington team has a lead, they're usually pretty golden in the 4th quarter. So those last 2 games between Washington and Utah were really hard fought, really physical, really aggressive games. And I think you can see a lot of Kyle Whittingham and Chris Peterson and vice versa in terms of the things that they really pride themselves on in terms of physicality, in terms of special teams. I mean, Utah special teams have been special for so long, I've almost lost track. I mean, you've got Mitch Wisnowski, Matt Gay. I mean, those guys are just continuing a legacy of amazing specialists that have come from like Australia, for instance, and have really, I mean, shoot, they've got Lou Groza award winners and Ray Guy winners that it's just a litany. I mean, they probably have more than any other team in the country that I can think of, honestly. It's just a real source of pride for them. And it's special teams is huge for Chris Peterson. We obviously seen it with Dante Pettis with the NCAA record he set last year for career punt returns for touchdowns. So again, I think there's a lot of similarities between the way these two coaches coach. And so I don't think you should expect anything less from Utah this year than we've seen the last few seasons from them when they come and play Washington. And it's become kind of almost a very unlikely rivalry in a weird sense. And I don't know if rivalry is even the right word for it, because they're obviously in 2 different divisions. They're not going up against each other necessarily every season, although these last few years they have. At some point, they're going to end up missing a couple years, because this year Washington misses Arizona and USC as far as the teams for the South. And everyone thought at the beginning of the year, oh, they're really dodging a bullet by missing Arizona. And now it's looking like bring Arizona on. So when it comes to Utah, you talked about Tyler Huntley. He was a huge thorn in Washington's side last year. Zach Moss is a really developing talent at running back. I don't necessarily think he's been all that great against Washington the last couple seasons, because 2 years ago it was Joe Williams was the guy that really had the monster year and came back and kind of almost was resurrected from the dead in terms of his career at Utah. And so he had a big game at Utah a couple years ago. But Zach Moss is obviously their main run threat now. You mentioned Britton Covey. There is a kid who he went and served his Mormon mission, now is back, and Chris Peterson's talking about how he thought Britton Covey may have come back too early because he wanted to make sure he didn't see him because he's a guy that 3 years ago was a player that they really had to deal with, and he's not a big kid. He's like 5'8", 5'9". He's very much kind of like a Chico McClatcher is at Washington, kind of a scat back slot guy, but they'll put him everywhere, and they'll try to get him the ball in space because he's super quick and super fast. They lost their main guy last year who had transferred from Oregon in terms of their main pass catching threat, but obviously they've got some freshmen now that are making up the ground, kind of like the way Washington's trying to do it a little bit with some younger guys. I think Utah is trying to supplement their pass game with some younger guys as well. And then, of course, on defense, Chase Hansen's the one name that really sticks out. He's moving from the secondary up to linebacker, and it sounds like, from all indications of guys that we've talked to down in Salt Lake City, it's been a pretty seamless transition. So expect a lot from Chase Hansen. And then you always know they're going to have big poly bodies up front, big Samoan dudes, 300 pounds plus. They put a bunch of them in the NFL. So that's coming. So there are just certain hallmarks of a Kyle Whittingham defense that everyone expects to see on Saturday.
I believe Chase Hansen was a Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Week. He had one of those games where he pretty much filled up the box score in regards to sacks, tackles for loss, and a pick. Passes defensed as well. Chase Hansen there at Utah. And, the team's going to be sturdy. I came across a stat in my prep work for the season in my prediction that Kyle Whittingham last season, they had a string of quote unquote bad luck, meaning one possession game losses, whether it was bad luck or not. But you can follow the narrative here. But prior to that, Kyle Whittingham had some incredible, because you figure over a length of time, it evens out 50-50. And he had like a 71 winning percentage in one possession games over his career at Utah, which speaks to great coaching. The special teams aspect, typically, unless you just recruit a great kicker, that speaks to coaching as well when you're that consistently good on special teams. And Kyle Whittingham's been able to pull that off at Utah. Right.
Yeah, I was going to say too, that it's just, it's a testament to him to be that consistent over time. And like you said, I mean, you look at maybe last week's game at Northern Illinois, for instance, they only score 17 points on the road like that, but that's a tricky game in the MAC. The level of competition down there is not that far off from Power 5. It just isn't. And we've seen that in the past. But, the way they play defense, the way they play special teams, the way they play field position, if even if Utah can't score a ton of points, even if their run game isn't going, or Huntley is just not feeling it in the pass game and maybe is a little off stride, their defense and their special teams are going to keep them in every single game they play. And so I think right now they're only averaging eight points a game given up on defense. It's that's kind of par for the course for them. If you look at their Pac-12 stats over the last handful of years, especially since they joined the Pac-12 in 2011, I'd be surprised if they had a year where they averaged more than 23, 24 points a game given up tops. They're just rock solid every year.
Yep. And NIU, to your point, has a recent history in the last 10 or 12 years of playing Big Ten teams in particular, because they're in that neck of the woods within one score and winning probably a quarter of those games, which is quite a feat for a MAC school. Washington, Utah, it's the featured game in the Pac-12. I'm going to enjoy this one for sure, and have enjoyed the conversation with Chris Fetters. You got to join him on dogman.com. It's the 247 Sports platform for Washington athletics. Of course, this is Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, so please like, comment, and subscribe. Chris, first effort here at Mark Rogers TV. It's been a while since I've been trying to track you down, and we've been trying to connect, so the conversation was great, and needed all your help here to break this one down. So I appreciate it.
Of course. Anytime, Mark. Anytime.
All right, everyone else. Cam Underwood, State of the U, coming up at 9 o'clock Eastern time to talk Miami football. Tricky game of sorts as we speak. Tricky games in the MAC as Miami goes to Toledo to take on the Rockets. We'll be back in just a few minutes with that. Chris, we'll see you again.
Okay.